40 years of marriage didn't end with a scream. It ended with the clinical sound of packing tape. While my children labeled my life as low priority, they didn't know their father had built a structural trap specifically for their greed. They thought they were evicting a frail old woman. They didn't realize they were triggering a legal demolition that would leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. At 68, I wasn't losing a home. I was reclaiming an empire they never even knew existed. 40 years of devotion vanished on a Tuesday morning. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, just the crisp sound of packing tape sealing cardboard boxes. Evelyn sat in the armchair by the window. It was the only piece of furniture not covered in protective plastic. The living room smelled of industrial cleaners and fresh cardboard. The familiar scent of cinnamon and old wood was gone. Her son, Arthur, had hired a professional moving crew. They moved with clinical efficiency. They wrapped porcelain figures in bubble wrap. They dismantled the heavy oak dining table. Evelyn watched her entire life being cataloged and boxed. Each sealed carton felt like a closed chapter. The house itself seemed to reject her presence. The bare walls echoed differently. The floorboards creaked under the heavy, unfamiliar boots of the workers. She was now merely a guest in the home she had built. Her daughter, Beatrice, stood by the stone fireplace. She held a silver tablet. Her fingers swiped rapidly through digital spreadsheets. She calculated depreciation rates and current market value. Arthur paced the hallway with a laser measuring tool. They spoke to each other in hushed, highly practical tones. They discussed assisted living facilities. They used sterile phrases like asset liquidation, care management, and footprint downsizing. They did not ask for their mother's opinion. They assumed her silent compliance. To her children, this transition was strictly a logistical problem. The emotional weight of the property was completely irrelevant. The family home was simply a real estate asset ready for market optimization. Evelyn realized the Sunday family dinners had always been a performance. The holiday gatherings were scheduled obligations. Her role as the respected matriarch expired the exact moment her husband, Thomas, passed away. Her utility to them had run out. Arthur and Beatrice now viewed her independence as a liability. They wanted her safe, contained, and entirely out of the way. Their version of care was a suffocating blanket of control. They systematically stripped away her agency under the guise of deep concern. A stack of leather-bound photo albums sat near the front door. Beatrice had labeled them with a thick black marker. The tag read, "Sentimental, low priority." Evelyn stared at the dark ink. Decades of memories were officially reduced to a low-priority inventory item. Her wedding crystal was packed in a wooden crate. The label directed it to a local auction house. Arthur decided the glassware was too fragile for her new apartment. She had never actually seen this new apartment. It was a ground-floor unit in a managed care complex. They selected it for its wheelchair accessibility. Evelyn walked perfectly fine. The grandfather clock in the study stopped ticking. The movers had unplugged it to secure the pendulum. The sudden silence felt incredibly heavy. Evelyn looked out the bay window. The rose bushes she planted 30 years ago were in full bloom. The real estate agent planned to pave over the garden next month. Concrete required less maintenance. Arthur agreed with the agent. Low maintenance meant higher appeal to modern buyers. Beatrice handed Evelyn a cup of lukewarm tea. It was served in a disposable paper cup. The fine china was already sealed in a shipping container. The gesture was entirely hollow. It was a flawless pantomime of caretaking. They managed her diet, her daily schedule, and her future. They genuinely convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. This absolute self-righteousness made them completely blind. They did not see the quiet shift happening behind Evelyn's calm expression. A stack of legal documents rested on the kitchen island. Power of attorney, transfer of deed, medical proxy. They needed her signature before noon. They presented the paperwork as a standard formality. They called it a simple administrative step to protect her remaining assets. They used dense, legal jargon to mask the total theft of her autonomy. The illusion of family unity shattered completely when Arthur handed the foreman a final checklist. He checked his luxury watch. He had a corporate flight to catch. Beatrice ordered a premium taxi service for their mother. The physical transition was scheduled for exactly 2 o'clock. They managed her relocation like a corporate merger. There was no malice in their actions. That was the most terrifying part of the morning. Their cold pragmatism left absolutely no room for an argument. An open conflict would have meant they recognized her as an equal opponent. Instead, they treated her like a fragile antique. They were simply storing her away safely. The movers carried out the last sofa. The living room was now entirely empty. Arthur and Beatrice stood by the open front door. They waited for her to stand up and exit. They expected a frail woman accepting her inevitable fate. Evelyn slid her hand into her cardigan pocket. Her fingers brushed against a heavy iron key. It did not belong to this house. It did not belong to the new ground-floor apartment. She closed her fist around the cold metal. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Evelyn stood alone on the front porch. Her meticulously packed suitcases remained inside the hallway. In the dining room behind her, the children were already debating the appraisal value of the antique silver. She did not turn her head. The paralyzing grief of the morning evaporated. A cold, surgical clarity took its place. She was no longer a discarded matriarch. She was a woman with a destination. A specific memory surfaced from the depths of a rainy Tuesday, 22 years ago. Her late husband, Thomas, had been sitting at his mahogany desk. He had handed her a heavy, oddly shaped iron key. His voice had been unusually stern. When the walls close in and the floor gives way, he had instructed, go to the old lumber yard at the edge of the county. Evelyn had buried that directive under decades of domestic routine. Raising children and managing a household had erased the urgency of his words. Now, the instruction echoed with absolute precision. Thomas was never a man given to melodrama. He was a structural engineer. He dealt in load-bearing walls and stress tests. He understood the breaking point of materials and people. If he gave a final directive, it possessed tangible, legal weight. She reached deep into the lining of her wool coat. Her fingers closed around cold, jagged metal. She had carried that key on a secondary ring for 2 decades. It had been a blind habit. Today, it transformed into a navigational tool. Evelyn walked down the driveway. She bypassed Beatrice's imported sedan. She stepped onto the gravel shoulder of the main road. The crisp autumn air stung her lungs. She embraced the harshness. It served as a physical anchor. A regional transit bus idled at the crossroads. She boarded without hesitation. She handed the driver exact change. She requested a ticket to Blackwood Creek. It was an abandoned industrial sector on the far side of the valley. The journey required 45 minutes of steady transit. Evelyn watched the landscape beyond the smudged glass shift rapidly. Manicured suburban lawns gave way to sprawling, overgrown fields. Strip malls faded into rusted silos. The physical distance mirrored her internal detachment. She was leaving behind a meticulously constructed illusion of family harmony. Her smartphone vibrated relentlessly in her leather purse. The screen flashed with her son's name. He was likely demanding the access codes to the family trust accounts. Evelyn powered the device down. The screen went black. For 30 years, she had played the role of the great pacifier. She had absorbed their tantrums. She had rationalized their selfishness as ambition. She had yielded personal territory, inch by inch, to keep the family intact. That era terminated the moment she stepped onto the bus. Submission was merely a learned behavior. Erasing it took less than an hour. She analyzed her children's actions with a new, detached perspective. Their greed was not a sudden mutation. It was a structural flaw, present from the beginning, ignored by a mother's blind love. Thomas had seen it. He had calculated the trajectory of their family dynamics long before his death. The bus hissed to a halt at a desolate intersection. Evelyn stepped down onto fractured asphalt. The vehicle pulled away, leaving her in profound isolation. The road ahead lacked pavement. Thick, thorny blackberry brambles choked the deep drainage ditches on either side. This was the old logging route. The timber corporation had filed for bankruptcy 15 years prior. The county had ceased maintenance shortly after. Nature had aggressively reclaimed the territory. She began to walk. Her low-heeled leather boots crushed dry twigs and brittle leaves. A dense canopy of ancient oak trees blocked the afternoon sun. Long gray shadows stretched across the compacted dirt. The temperature dropped significantly in the shade. The physical exertion cleared the last remnants of emotional fog from her mind. A rusted chain-link fence materialized on her left. The attached warning signs were bleached white by years of sunlight. Evelyn located the specific structural gap Thomas had pointed out during a long-forgotten drive. She slipped carefully through the tangled wire. Her coat caught briefly on a sharp barb. She pulled it free, leaving a small tuft of wool behind. The terrain sloped downward toward a dried, rocky riverbed. There, half concealed by aggressive, creeping ivy, stood the structure. It was not a grand estate or a hidden mansion. It was a brutalist, windowless cinderblock utility shed. It originally housed the electrical generators for the defunct mill. The corrugated metal roof sagged under the weight of accumulated pine needles. Evelyn halted 3 paces from the entrance. The silence in the ravine was absolute. There was no traffic noise. There were no arguing heirs dividing her legacy. Only the sound of the wind moving through the dead branches remained. The isolation was complete. It was exactly what she required. She withdrew the iron key from her pocket. It felt significantly heavier in the palm of her hand. The heavy steel door was coated in a thick layer of oxidized orange rust. A massive, industrial-grade padlock secured the latch. It was a relic of a bygone manufacturing era. Thomas had chosen this specific location for a strategic reason. He had prepared a sanctuary out of sight of the local authorities and greedy relatives. Or, quite possibly, an arsenal of information. Evelyn stepped up to the rusted metal. She aligned the key with the keyhole. The heavy brass padlock secured the iron latch. Rust had fused the keyhole shut. Someone had locked this industrial bunker exactly 3 decades ago. They intended to isolate its contents from the world. Thomas had wanted absolute secrecy. Evelyn stood in the center of the ravine. Dust suspended in the air. The silence felt heavy. It carried the scent of dry rot and rusted iron. This space existed outside the daily rhythm of the life she just left. It was a dead zone. She approached the corner where a massive oak chest sat, half buried under discarded canvas tarps. She pulled the heavy fabric away. The wood beneath was pristine. The tarps had shielded the oak from moisture and decay. She gripped the cold metal of the lock. It was a solid, industrial-grade mechanism. She aligned the iron key Thomas had given her. She applied steady pressure. A sharp crack shattered the silence. The internal pins of the lock snapped. The heavy brass body fell to the concrete floor. It landed with a dull thud. The latch was finally free. Evelyn rested her palms on the domed lid. The surface was bound in tarnished copper strips. She pushed upward. The iron hinges shrieked. They protested the sudden friction after years of dormancy. The lid fell back against the cinder block wall. A distinct wave of air rose from the dark interior. It was a concentrated blend of camphor, aged parchment, and dried leather. This was not a box of forgotten household junk. It was a deliberately curated archive. She looked inside. The internal layout revealed Thomas's meticulous engineering mind. A thick layer of waxed canvas covered the top. This secondary barrier protected the contents from humidity. Evelyn peeled the fabric back. The canvas was stiff and brittle. Beneath the protective layer lay a series of custom-built compartments. Thin cedar dividers separated the space into 3 distinct sections. On the far left sat a stack of leather-bound ledgers. Their spines were deeply creased. The gold leaf lettering had oxidized into a dull green. In the exact center rested a velvet-lined mahogany box. To the right, a bundle of rolled architectural blueprints occupied a cylindrical slot. A faded silk ribbon held the paper together. Every object had a specific placement. There were no loose photographs. There were no sentimental trinkets. This collection served a functional purpose. It was an assembly of hard evidence. Evelyn reached for the mahogany box. The small brass clasp yielded without resistance. Inside lay a heavy set of cast-iron keys strung on a braided steel ring. They were large, skeleton-style keys. They did not fit any modern door in the estate. Beside the keys sat a silver pocket watch. The casing was tarnished black. The hands were permanently frozen at 8:15. The glass face was cracked straight down the middle. She shifted her focus to the ledgers. She lifted the top volume from the stack. It weighed heavily in her hands. The cover consisted of dark green Morocco leather. She opened the heavy cover to the first page. The handwriting was sharp. The ink was a deep, unfaded black. Columns of precise numbers filled the margins. Dates from 40 years ago lined the left side of the page. These were not records of daily expenses. The entries detailed land parcel acquisitions. They listed surveyor coordinates and international bank transfer codes. Next to several entries, small red check marks indicated completed transactions. Evelyn set the ledger aside. She picked up the rolled blueprints. The silk ribbon disintegrated into dust the moment she touched it. She unrolled the thick, blue-tinted paper. White lines intersected to form a massive, complex grid. It was a master topographical map of the entire surrounding valley. Red ink circled specific geographic boundaries. Notes written in the margins detailed mineral rights and deep-water access points. The borders drawn on this old map directly contradicted the current property lines. They extended far beyond the modern fences erected by her children. The map proved the estate was originally 3 times larger than its current footprint. She placed the map gently on the floor. Returning to the chest, she noticed a structural discrepancy. The cedar dividers did not reach the actual bottom of the trunk. There was a gap of exactly 2 inches. Evelyn pressed her fingertips against the floor of the central compartment. The wood shifted slightly under pressure. It was a false bottom. She wedged her fingernails into the narrow seam along the edge. She pulled upward with a sharp jerk. A thin sheet of cedar popped out of its frame. A hidden cavity lay exposed. Inside rested a single, thick, manila envelope. It was sealed shut with dark red wax. The wax bore the deep imprint of a notary public seal. Next to the envelope sat a pristine silver dollar. The coin was dated exactly 1 century ago. It showed 0 signs of circulation. The envelope was the true focal point of the chest. It was rigid. It clearly held documents of significant legal weight. The deliberate, multi-layered concealment spoke volumes. The architect of this time capsule had anticipated a future conflict. They had prepared an airtight defense. They had left a silent, undeniable witness to the truth. Evelyn reached into the cavity. Her fingers brushed the cold silver coin. She grasped the wax-sealed envelope. The heavy, aged paper crackled under her touch. The heavy leather portfolio smelled of dry paper and old ink. Evelyn untied the faded silk ribbon. Inside lay the exact blueprint of Thomas's foresight. Thomas had always been a quiet man. His silence, it turned out, was not absence. It was meticulous preparation. She spread the contents across the rough wooden table inside the bunker. The dim light from the high, narrow vent illuminated a thick stack of legal files. These were not copies. They were original documents, bearing raised notary seals and fresh-looking signatures. She opened the first envelope. The postmark was dated 25 years ago. It contained a memorandum from a senior partner at a prominent corporate law firm. The text bypassed all sentimentality. It detailed a series of aggressive, highly shielded financial maneuvers. Thomas had anticipated this exact scenario. He knew the true nature of their children well before they matured into it. He had recognized Arthur's ruthless impatience early on. He had seen Beatrice's cold, calculating pragmatism. Thomas had watched them demand more while contributing absolutely nothing to the family legacy. He had mapped the cracks in the family facade decades before they finally shattered. Evelyn unfolded a large, yellowed ledger. Column after column of handwritten figures revealed a hidden parallel economy. The children believed the family's primary manufacturing business funded their lavish lifestyles. They were wrong. Thomas had been quietly diverting the core assets for over 2 decades. He did not leave the estate vulnerable to standard probate laws. He systematically transferred the primary wealth into an irrevocable trust. He established this entity in a jurisdiction known for absolute corporate privacy. Evelyn was listed as the sole, lifetime beneficiary and the ultimate trustee. The children were completely and deliberately excluded from this entire structure. A secondary file contained bank statements from offshore accounts she never knew existed. Thomas had funneled a specific percentage of every major business acquisition into these secure reserves. The numbers printed on the pages were staggering. They represented absolute financial autonomy. He had spent the last 20 years of his life building a hidden empire beneath the visible one. He did this specifically to ensure Evelyn would never have to rely on her children for survival. The most crucial document lay at the very bottom of the stack. It was a thick, watermarked property deed, accompanied by a complex topographical land survey. It concerned the main estate. This was the exact property Arthur and Beatrice were currently emptying of furniture. The children held a deed, which they believed gave them total control over the land. It was a surface-level illusion. Thomas had executed a masterstroke of property law. He had created a life estate deed with a hidden, automatic reversionary clause. The land did not belong to the family name. It belonged to an anonymous holding company. Evelyn owned 100% of the voting shares in that specific company. The children merely possessed a temporary, conditional lease. This lease granted them the illusion of ownership, but it came with a fatal tripwire. The contract explicitly stated that the lease expired the exact second the tenants attempted to sell, transfer, or encumber the property without the holding company's written consent. Evelyn read the clause 3 times. The legal jargon was dense, but the practical meaning was crystal clear. Their eviction notices were worthless pieces of paper. Their aggressive real estate listings were technically fraudulent. By attempting to sell the estate and force her out, Arthur and Beatrice had triggered the penalty clause. They had legally evicted themselves. They had instantly voided their own right to even stand on the driveway. She traced the embossed corporate seal with her index finger. The balance of power did not just shift in this dusty bunker. It completely inverted. The children thought they were discarding an obsolete burden. Instead, they were actively trespassing on her private, corporate-owned land. A handwritten note was securely clipped to the back of the deed. Thomas's familiar, sharp script filled the single page. He explained his actions with brutal honesty. He wrote about a specific dinner party 15 years ago. He had overheard Arthur and Beatrice discussing the division of his assets while he was still perfectly healthy. That conversation had been the catalyst. He realized they viewed their parents merely as temporary obstacles to their inheritance. Thomas built a fortress out of binding contracts, blind trusts, and corporate veils. He designed a trap that would only spring if the children acted on their absolute worst impulses. If they had treated Evelyn with basic respect, the secret structure would have seamlessly transferred the wealth to them upon her passing. Their own greed was the specific key that locked them out of the kingdom. He gave Evelyn the ultimate defense mechanism. She carefully folded the documents. She placed them back into the leather portfolio, securing the ribbon tightly. The air in the bunker felt entirely different now. It was no longer a forgotten archive of the past. It was a tactical armory for the present. Evelyn stood up. She smoothed the wrinkles from her heavy wool coat. Her posture was perfectly straight. The lingering fatigue of the past few weeks had completely vanished. She had entered this hidden space as an exile, pushed out by the people she had raised. She was leaving it as the undisputed legal owner of everything they coveted. The architecture of Thomas's secret was flawless. It was time to go back to the main house. It was time to watch her children pack their bags. The front door clicked shut. It was the exact same sound it made this morning, yet the entire fabric of reality within the house had shifted. Evelyn stepped into the hallway. The scent of cardboard boxes and industrial packing tape filled the air. She could hear voices coming from the living room. Arthur and Beatrice were deep in conversation. They were dividing the antique silverware. Their tones were measured and calm. They sounded like corporate liquidators, closing a routine acquisition. They did not expect her back before sunset. They certainly did not expect the heavy leather folder currently gripped in her right hand. Arthur looked up from his digital tablet. He wore a tight, patronizing smile. He immediately started explaining the revised schedule for the moving truck. He spoke slowly. He used the voice reserved for confused toddlers or the elderly. Beatrice did not even bother to turn around. She was entirely focused on wrapping a silver teapot in layers of bubble wrap. Evelyn walked past the neatly stacked towers of her own belongings. She did not glance at the boxes labeled with her name. She walked straight to the center of the room. A massive oak dining table dominated the space. She cleared a section of it with one swift sweep of her arm. A stack of inventory lists fluttered to the floor. The sudden, sharp movement made both of her children freeze. Evelyn opened the leather folder. She extracted a thick sheaf of yellowed parchment. It was the original deed of trust, accompanied by a freshly stamped registry extract. She had visited the county clerk on her way back. The ink on the certification was dark. The embossed seals were undeniable. She did not shout. She did not demand their attention. She simply smoothed the papers flat against the wood. She tapped her index finger on the final paragraph. Arthur sighed. His annoyance was palpable. He stepped forward, clearly intending to humor her. He leaned over the table. His eyes casually scanned the legal phrasing. The silence in the room stretched. It lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. The patronizing smile slowly melted off Arthur's face. His posture grew rigid. Beatrice finally put down the silver teapot. She sensed the sudden vacuum of sound. She walked over to her brother and looked over his shoulder. The color completely drained from Arthur's cheeks. The document was unambiguous. The property was never transferred to their father's sole estate. It was held in a joint, irrevocable survivorship trust. Upon his passing, absolute ownership reverted exclusively to Evelyn. The children possessed zero legal claim to the land, the bricks, or the silverware. Their entire early inheritance scheme relied on a flawed, outdated will they had found in a desk drawer. They had built a fortress of entitlement on a foundation of sand. "There is a mistake," Arthur said. His voice cracked. The confident liquidator was gone. He reached blindly for his phone. Evelyn pulled the papers back. She slid them neatly into the protective folder. "Call your attorney," she said. Her tone was completely flat. "He will confirm the registry data. You have exactly 24 hours to remove your personal vehicles and packing supplies from my property." Beatrice gasped. She immediately defaulted to her usual tactic. She attempted to manufacture tears. She reached out to grab her mother's hand. Evelyn stepped back. The physical distance mirrored the emotional chasm between them. The tears did not fall. The shock of the power reversal was too genuine to allow for fake crying. This morning, they had treated her like a burdensome piece of furniture. They were moving her out to maximize their real estate portfolio. Now, they were legally classified as trespassers. Evelyn watched their physical forms collapse under the weight of the truth. Arthur's shoulders slumped forward. Beatrice crossed her arms defensively, shrinking into herself. The power dynamic in the room inverted completely. Evelyn did not need to justify her presence. She did not need to argue or plead for her own home. The paperwork did the heavy lifting. Decades of subtle disrespect and quiet marginalization dissolved against cold, notarized facts. They had fundamentally underestimated her. They had assumed her quiet grief meant compliance. They mistook her silence for ignorance. Evelyn walked over to the large bay window. She looked out at the sprawling garden. She had planted those climbing roses 30 years ago. They belonged to her. The soil beneath their feet, the roof over their heads, the foundation of the building. All of it was hers. She turned back to face the room. Arthur was staring blankly at the floorboards. Beatrice was frantically typing a message on her phone. The illusion of their control was entirely shattered. The eviction notice was delivered verbally, but it carried the absolute weight of state law. "Leave the teapot," Evelyn instructed. "The silver stays with the house." She picked up her folder. She walked past them toward the kitchen. She needed a glass of water. She left them standing awkwardly among the half-packed boxes. The house was quiet again, but this time it was her silence, her rules. The transition of power was absolute. The heavy brass key did not slide across the mahogany table. Evelyn dropped it. The metal struck the polished wood with a dull, final thud. Arthur and Beatrice stared at the object. They did not reach for it. The balance of power had shifted permanently. The silence in the dining room carried a new weight. It was the sound of absolute defeat. The probate lawyer's office smelled of floor wax and old paper. Mr. Vance adjusted his glasses under the fluorescent lights. He read the deed of trust aloud. The documents recovered from the hidden bunker were indisputable. The estate belonged entirely to Evelyn. The children's previous claims dissolved into legal irrelevance. They had attempted to contest the signature on the addendum. A forensic handwriting expert verified the strokes within 48 hours. The land, the primary residence, the investment accounts, everything reverted to her sole control. Evelyn signed the final transfer papers. Her handwriting was sharp. Her fingers did not tremble. The legal machinery moved swiftly. The title company recorded the new deed by Friday afternoon. The children received formal notification via certified mail. They were given 30 days to remove their personal effects from the property. Evelyn did not return to the main house to pack. She hired a liquidation firm. Professionals in gray uniforms boxed the porcelain. They wrapped the crystal. They dismantled the heavy oak furniture. Evelyn kept only 2 medium-sized suitcases. They contained practical clothing and essential documents. The rest of her accumulated history went to an estate auction. Strangers bid on her past. She watched the online auction interface from a hotel room. She felt no nostalgia. The antique clocks and Persian rugs were no longer family heirlooms. They were simply converted equity. The property went on the market the following Tuesday. It sold in 14 days. A corporate developer purchased the lot for cash. They planned to tear down the colonial structure and subdivide the land. Evelyn approved the sale without hesitation. The walls had harbored coldness and subtle manipulation. Now, They were just a line item on a bank statement. The funds cleared into a private, offshore secured account. Only one name sat on the master ledger: hers. Evelyn relocated to the northern coast. She chose a town 200 miles away from her previous life. The climate was sharper. The air carried the constant scent of salt and pine. She purchased a rocky plot of land on a slight elevation. The parcel overlooked a gray, turbulent stretch of the Atlantic. She hired an architect known for severe, minimalist design. Her instructions were precise: single-story, flat roof, wide, triple-paned windows facing the ocean. No guest rooms, no extra bathrooms. The space was engineered strictly for one occupant. Construction took 11 months. Evelyn rented a small, furnished apartment nearby to oversee the daily progress. She selected every material with clinical precision. Polished concrete floors replaced the memory of plush carpets. Matte black steel fixtures stood in stark contrast to the brass of her past. The exterior featured untreated cedar cladding. The wood would weather to a silver gray, blending with the coastal fog. There was no room for compromise. Every hinge, every light switch, every thermostat reflected her direct, unfiltered choice. The landscaping was equally deliberate. She rejected manicured lawns and decorative flower beds. Contractors planted native dune grass. They arranged large, asymmetrical granite boulders around the perimeter. The environment required zero maintenance. It thrived in the harsh coastal winds. Phone calls from Arthur became infrequent. Beatrice sent a generic greeting card during the winter holidays. Evelyn replied with polite, neutral text messages. The emotional umbilical cord was severed. She no longer sought their approval. She no longer feared their subtle dismissals. The financial leverage they once held was eradicated. Without that leverage, the relationship settled into a distant, formal acquaintance. Evelyn accepted this reality. It brought a profound psychological clarity. Moving day was quiet. No family gathered to carry boxes. Evelyn unpacked her 2 suitcases before noon. She arranged a single leather armchair by the largest window. She sat and watched the waves. On the small teak table beside her lay the rusted iron key from the bunker. It wasn't a souvenir of betrayal. It was the tool she had used to dismantle a prison and build a fortress. She was no longer losing a home. She had finally found herself.